All right, welcome to today's re-recording of our Inclusive Education in Private Schools, 5 Keys to Success. So the Progress Center, which is an OSEP-funded center, and All Belong Center for Inclusive Education, you'll learn a little bit about them later in the session, are excited to share evidence-based practices, resources that can help private school educators meet the increasingly diverse needs of their student population. Now, this webinar is intended for private school associations and educators responsible for developing and implementing instruction for struggling students and students with disabilities. In this webinar, All Belong Center for Inclusive Education will present 5 keys to inclusive education that benefit all students. And then that will be followed by 2 of our esteemed local private school educators who will share how they have implemented these keys to success to get results. And then we'll close today with some freely available resources. So my name is Tessie Rose Bailey, and I am the director of the Progress Center. And we are a federally funded center that provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators in a variety of settings, including traditional public, charter, private schools, and alternative educational settings. Now, our focus for the center is on the development and implementation of high-quality educational programming, not specific programs, but programming that enable children with disabilities to make progress and meet challenging goals. As part of our year 2, which is now, we are working with select local educators across different educational settings, including private schools, with the purpose of developing educator knowledge, skills, and school infrastructure to promote progress for students with disabilities. I'm going to moderate today's Q&A session, which is towards the end, but I am happy to be joined by Dr. Kathleen Fanensteel, and she served as our Progress Center private school liaison and is a technical assistance provider for the center. Kathleen?
Great, thanks. Welcome. Our objectives for today are to share recent data surrounding students who struggle and students with disabilities in placements other than public schools. And then, as Tessie mentioned, All Belong is going to share 5 keys to inclusive education that benefit all students. So first, we're going to start off with what is the state of students with disabilities and the role of the Progress Center. The Progress Center focuses on promoting progress for students with disabilities through the development and implementation of high-quality educational programming. For most students with disabilities, this begins with the development of an IEP, or an individualized education program, that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances, or a service plan, as we see at many private schools, developed in collaboration with a nearby district or family. FAPE, or Free and Appropriate Public Education, is often associated with IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but it is also a requirement under 504, which is applicable to any entity that accepts federal assistance. Regardless, all schools must consider individual student needs and discuss strategies and system approaches to meeting the needs of all students, including those with parent-disclosed and not yet identified disabilities. Now that you've heard about progress, you might be wondering, well, how does private school fit into progress, or why the sudden focus? First, when we look at the data of disabilities that are considered high incidence or less severe, you may have students that have disabilities in your schools. Additionally, when we consider the increase in students with disabilities, the chances of your current families having a sibling with disabilities is much higher. Currently, about 1.5% of school-age students identified under IDEA as having a disability are educated in private schools. There are likely students in your schools that are not yet identified as having a disability, either under IDEA or what is referred to as Section 504. Private schools are not obligated to provide special education as defined by IDEA like public entities. However, classroom teachers in private schools are still tasked with providing a quality private school education to meet the needs for all students in their class. Over the 10 years, data indicate that enrollment in private schools has been increasing. This may be in part of a response of parents searching for alternatives to public school closures during the COVID pandemic. It may also be related to parents for educational alternatives for their child. In interviews with parents conducted by the Progress Center in 2020, parents of private school students with disabilities indicated that private schools offered more flexibility, greater autonomy, and small class sizes that they perceive would provide their child greater opportunity for student success. As a result, about a half of private schools have seen an increase in enrollment, and private school associations, in an annual forum facilitated by Progress Center this past fall, reported that private schools were seeing more students with disclosed and not yet identified disabilities. In a brief survey we conducted with private school educators, 78% indicated that they did not feel as prepared as they believed they needed to be to support these students. As a result, Progress Center, under the direction of OSEP, or the Office of Special Education Programs, provides access to information and free publicly available resources to support local private school educators in their efforts to supporting students with disabilities. And as part of that, I am excited to turn this over to our panelists. We are joined by Elizabeth Dombrowski, the Executive Director of All Belong, where she serves as champion for ability inclusion in schools and churches. I'm going to have Elizabeth introduce Brenda and Mark, our two esteemed colleagues and educators, to talk about their work in schools. All right, Elizabeth, I'm going to hand this over to you now.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'm really grateful to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this. I'm going to briefly introduce who we are, get into the keys, and then I'm going to ask Brenda and Mark to share a little bit about their experience. So we will continue to move forward with that. So just so that you know, I am the Executive Director of All Belong, and All Belong is a nonprofit organization working with schools and churches all across the country to equip congregations and schools for purposeful, innovative inclusion of students of all abilities. Can we switch the slide? And then, so we want to come alongside different contexts to really create a community of belonging for students of all abilities. And that's what we see ourselves doing. So to do that, we have a team of teacher consultants. We work with a team of school psychologists, and we have a team of church consultants who partner with various communities. So we've been around for about 40 years, and over that time, we've gone through several iterations as an organization. And I'm gonna, in one of my next slides, I'm gonna get into a little bit more about those iterations that you might see in different places. We were launched in 1979. We started as a school within a school as the Christian Learning Center. Then for a while, we became the CLC Network, and now we have rebranded a couple of years ago to All Belong. So we work with 70 schools right now in 9 states all across the country, and that allows us to spread inclusion and belonging and the knowledge that we have learned to a lot of different places. So that's what we're trying to do. Our work is constantly growing and expanding, but our mission is staying the same, and we're here to help. So it is from this history and from this evolution that we have walked that we can share these 5 keys with you today. This is a slide up on the screen right now about 5 stages of a continuum. And often we see this continuum both in our history as an organization and in the history of disability rights in this country, and in different ways that we might approach special education in non-public schools. So at the very left of this continuum is a circle with lots of little different shades of gray circles within it. And that circle is meant to represent community, right? So the ways in which we live and work together. But in the first stage of exclusion, there are holes in that community because people with disabilities are not there. And we can remember things like that. I'm sure you can think of different contexts where you might have seen that in place. We see that a lot, right? So 20% of the population has a disability of some kind. Either when we look around, if we're not seeing people with disabilities in our community, it's because we don't know about their disability or they're not there. And so that's that first stage of exclusion. The next one over then is segregation. And that's where we start to see circles that are filled in with different colors. And those different colors represent people who might learn or operate or experience the world differently. And that one is segregation. So we have a place for people with disabilities, but it is off to the side and it is separate from our traditional notions of community that we would see. The next one is integration, and that's where we would see people with disabilities, as those colorful circles, have a place. But often this can also be seen as mainstreaming, as a school within a school. Some of those different words that we use, right? Mainstreaming was really popular in the 90s. It's when we first started talking about putting people with disabilities in the same school as their age-appropriate peers, but they were in a separate program. So this is really how our organization started. We were in a separate program. My sister went to a separate school within a school. And so that's where we see integration. The next one over becomes inclusion. And this, I hope, starts to feel more familiar to what our communities look like today. In the inclusion model, we have the circle, and we have people with disabilities throughout that circle really intentionally. Now, the problem we came across with that, for a long time, this model stopped at inclusion. And we ran into some difficulties because the question became, who gets to decide where those people with disabilities live in that community, and who gets to carve out those places, and who is really in charge of that? And that pushed, I think, a lot of disability scholars to begin thinking about belonging, much as Dr. Carter has represented here. And in a model of belonging, it impacts every person in a community. It impacts the way each of us relate to each other and understand ourselves. And in that model of belonging, there may be areas that we can carve out for ourselves, but our strengths and weaknesses are complementary to each other and to a lot of different places. So we have done a poll on this to see where folks who might be interested in this webinar stood. And it came out to be primarily in the area of inclusion. So we can picture that fourth step on the continuum of having a lot of the schools, non-public schools, see themselves as a place of inclusion, which is fantastic. But as you can imagine, being one of these circles, being one of the gray circles or being one of the colorful circles is going to feel differently in each of these scenarios. And I encourage you to give that some thought and to reflect on it and to seek out Dr. Carter's work in other ways. So as we think about that picture of belonging, we like to think of ourselves at All Belong as being made in green and pink. And we like to think of ourselves as green and pink puzzle pieces. So in a green and pink puzzle piece, like I'm holding up here, it's one puzzle piece. It has half of it is colored in green and half of it is colored in pink. And then we like to think of ourselves as in green are our strengths, in pink are our weaknesses. And we all have strengths and weaknesses. But when I'm doing a presentation like this, I hope that you only see my green. I don't really want to show the world my pinks. But then when we think about students with disabilities, particularly visible disabilities in our school communities, our culture and society may only see the pink, and they have greens too. So there are no all green people, there are no all pink people, and we are designed to fit together in community. So when one of those puzzle pieces is missing, we really all miss out. We are all incomplete without each other. And that is it's a lesson plan that we often do with students. You're welcome to do it yourself if you wish. And that is how the framework on which the rest of these keys of inclusive education are going to be built. So I have separated these 5 keys into 2 categories. The first 2 keys are really student focused. And I say student focused because these are the keys of inclusion that we want students to experience in our schools and in inclusive education in a community of belonging. The first one is ownership. And in an ownership situation, when you ask a student with a disability who their teacher is, they're going to say their general education teacher. We don't want them to hang their coat in a separate classroom, right? That we're trying to move towards that picture of belonging. We also want the student to claim ownership of their peers, their age-appropriate peers, and for their peers to claim ownership of them. This will come back in some of the future school-focused keys as well, because we really want an entire school team to own the student's educational experience. inclusive education is not something that we can just put on one staff member and expect that to go well, right? We can find a lot of amazing staff members, don't get me wrong, but it is a team approach and a very collaborative approach where everyone is invested in the success of a student. The next student-focused key then is friendship. And just as us as adults, sometimes we need information about each other in order to develop a relationship. So do kids. So a big piece of planning for inclusive education and a community of belonging is to plan for intentional times of cultivating friendship and teaching students how to interact with one another well. So we want to intentionally cultivate those friendships, but we still want them to be authentic. And to do that, we also have to model that situation and give peers information that they might need about what might work well with a student and when it's appropriate to not help a student, right? So it's some of that balance that we're working through in this second piece of friendship. But friendship is incredibly important, especially for students with disabilities and in building that community that we want to see. So the next three keys then are much more focused on the school community and the systems and the structures that might be in place or need to be in place to do this well. And each of these three keys, these are pretty broad pictures, but there is much more detail if you look at the Christ-Centered Educational Services Standard, which I encourage you to access. It's free to use, and you can use it as a self-assessment or a guide going forward, and you'll see the link to that. So the first of those keys then to doing inclusive education really well is community. And I often get this mixed up when I'm talking about these keys with the idea of commitment, because we have to build a foundation with parents for trust. I am willing to bet that most of your schools, you have students with disabilities there, but you might not know a whole lot about them. And the way we find out more information about a student and really build that foundation of trust is to make that commitment upfront and to stick it, because it's not necessarily the expectation of every parent in your community that you are going to be serving students of all abilities. So if we can say that, we can set a foundation for what we're trying to do here and be very clear about that. Another piece of living that out then is, so we've made that verbal commitment to inclusion. To live that out, we really have to think about tuition equity too. Tuition equity is the idea that parents of students with disabilities pay no more in tuition than any other student. And the way we are able to do that is to think of special education, think of inclusive education as part of a multi-tiered system of support, as part of an entire system that can respond to the needs of individual students. And when we aren't charging parents any more in tuition for whatever services they might receive, we give ourselves as educators the freedom to provide kids with what they need to succeed. And that's really important to the idea of belonging as well. So the next one, the second school-focused key then, our fourth in total, is the idea of collaboration. And I referred to this a little bit earlier, but so often when I go into a school and I'm talking with educators, and they're thinking about doing greater inclusion of kids with disabilities, general education teachers can often be afraid that this is going to be just another thing on their plate and that there's not going to be any support for these students. And that's where we really need to intentionally build collaboration time, resources, conversations into our days to ensure that every student can succeed. And it is an investment. It is an investment in that multi-tiered system of support, and it benefits all students. And so that's a really important piece. To do that collaboration well, then, we also need to communicate well. This sounds like well, of course we do, right? But it's so important, and we see it over and over again that we need to communicate student goals, we need to communicate student accommodations, and then we need to collaborate with the local public school district for things like speech, physical therapy, or occupational therapy often. And that brings me to the last of the 5 keys, which really is culture. And in the key of culture, I want to see the community and the collaboration and all of the investments we've made into those great statements and time for collaborating turn into and really manifest into a culture of belonging, where differences among students and among abilities are celebrated and welcomed and planned for and anticipated, right? So we know that students coming here will develop needs over the course of their educational journey, and we're going to be there to support them. So part of this then is also assessing ourselves and making sure that everything we do is based on the student. So often I see decisions based on a diagnosis without really understanding what that means for the student. And that's where we really have to slow down, back up, and see what's going on, think about it, and then determine what to do based on a really excellent knowledge and understanding of that particular student. And that takes time to get to know every student really individually and respond to them, but it is so worth it. And so that's what I'm going to share with you, Brenda Moth and Mark Krom to share their experiences, because they've been making this happen for decades, both of them. And I'm going to start with Brenda. She is an ESS director at North Point Christian Schools. And she has been working to build this community of belonging and been able to watch the fruits of such an effort. So I will hand it over to you, Brenda, to share your experiences.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for allowing me the chance to share today our story. At North Point Christian, inclusion has been a natural progression for us of our desire to know excellently and love well our students. There have been some fundamental keys to this process for us. One of them has been our mandates and school mission, which empower us to equip students to impact their world. Also, our long-standing partnership with All Belong, which includes having pioneers alongside us to ask hard questions and to give wise direction in this journey. Another key foundational piece has been the vision and life experiences of our administration, and lots of brave moments of them saying, you know, this is the right thing. This is best practice. Let's do it well. Other foundational pieces would include our commitment to building strong families, as Elizabeth has alluded to, and our partnership with our local providers. And we are very blessed in that way. Some key thinking for us has included our mandates, as I mentioned, one being the image mandate and our desire to seek to really celebrate, to know well and celebrate each individual as an image bearer with pink areas and green areas. True inclusion begins not with what I can do or what I know, but rather who we are, the heart of the matter. And that brings us to the second matter of thinking, which is the love mandate. And for us, recognizing that teaching is first of all caring and responding in a caring manner. This belonging together in partnership and learning is really transformational for each of the members, for the teachers, for each of the students. And we see ourselves as individual, uniquely made puzzle pieces that fit together in an ordained pattern. And we want each and every member of our community to experience belonging and citizenship, not just feel as though they're squatters or aliens in their environment. And the third piece would include that there needs to be room at the table for all, our mission mandate. This mindset toward building belonging includes belonging in relationship, belonging in service, belonging in community. We get to do this together, and that's exciting for us. Along the way, there have been some pivotal conversations and experiences and friendships. So if I could mention, we started early on with some training that involved building a common mindset and language together. And that one of those pieces was studying all kinds of minds. Another one was studying neurodiversity and differentiated instruction. And those trainings were led by our teaching consultants at All Belong, and we're grateful for that. I might mention at this point that certainly you may be wondering, did you run into resistance? Of course. It is expected that even as educators within our learning communities, that we are all on a certain continuum of understanding and embracing belonging. And so we need to have honest conversations along the way, and to exercise some growth mindset, and to have training opportunities so that we can grow together in this. And as that happens, we find that resistance begins to dissipate. They begin to see the fruit of their labors and their partnership and collaboration. So friendships. Very early on, there was a very beautiful, winsome, and charismatic young man who taught us so very much about strengths and challenges. And I remember two of his peers conversing early on. And for me, it was a very important conversation where the one said to the other, you know, this young man is really gifted in understanding scripture. And that was a beginning among our student body of them beginning to really embrace each other more fully. Another unique friendship that we had was with a beautiful 10th grade girl that transferred into our learning community, and to that point had never been able to be in a neurodiverse setting where she was able to do presentations and projects with her peers. And she was involved in a group of young ladies who did a beautiful presentation on the book of Ruth that involved writing their own rap song and sharing it. And this was the first time in her whole education that she'd been able to do that. She went on and 2 years later graduated and was able to do a beautiful job publicly on her senior presentation. Another pivotal friendship was with a young man who we first met in our school parking lot, and he would travel through our parking lot where his parents dropped off siblings and took him onto another school. We noted that he was distressed about that. We invited the family to the table. We had a conversation. He enrolled and is now a graduate of our school and has gone on to a local university where he's doing very well. So those individuals in friendship and belonging taught us so much early on. We continue to learn very much about achievable challenge for each of our individuals and holding high expectations. What does that look like? Developing person-guided plans, partnering with ABA therapists. So we continue on that growth continuum together toward belonging, and we're grateful for All Belong for being with us on this journey.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Appreciate it, and appreciate the specific stories of students. It's wonderful to hear about. Mark, we would love to turn this over to you. We wanted Mark to share his experience as an administrator and the unique role that that plays in inclusive education and your approach to doing so. Mark? Is Mark here?
Is that better?
That is better, but we
All
can't
right.
see you yet.
All right, hold on.
Perfect.
How about now?
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Still not as many technical difficulties as we had it the first time. Hey, I am really thankful to be invited to be a part of this webinar. I'm Mark Krom, and I became the principal K-8 building for Grand Rapids Christian Schools in 1997. I was blessed to be joining a school that was already a member of the CLC network. We were already committed to including students with learning and physical and social and emotional needs. Our school actually had a fairly robust learning support program, and also included quite a few kids with physical and social and emotional needs. So I kind of came into it as it was already running. One of my responsibilities as a principal, and I think this will resonate with all school leaders, is to interview parents. and especially to interview parents that would like to enroll their children in your school. You know, we need to determine right away if we can truly meet the needs of their children. We investigate who their children are and what needs they have. And early on in during these conversations with parents, I was like deeply touched by the thought that that parent, a young person with a child, was sitting in front of me, desperately wanted to send their kids to a school where they could trust that their kids would be taken well care of. And this was even more evident when I was talking to parents with kids who had high needs. They were asking me, Mr. K, can you do it? Can we trust your school to educate our kids? I know our kids are tough. I know our kids have unique needs. Can they please come to your school? And I became committed. We're not going to let them down. They can join us. Inclusion is founded on the belief that all children are created with equal full value. Some aren't more valuable than others. They're all equally valued. Inclusion is a passion. We see kids as individuals. We don't see them as classes. And we train them and teach them as individuals and not as groups. We would never teach children content that they already know. We would never teach children content that they're not ready to learn. And we should never expect behaviors from children who aren't ready to behave in those ways, or that haven't been trained, or haven't had the opportunity, or aren't prepared to behave. Inclusion is a passion to see kids as individuals. Inclusion is also something that is just tremendously valuable for all the kids. We don't include as a favor to a small subset of kids who have high needs. We include because it's good for all of us and for our community to include. I love Elizabeth's diagrams where the colored dots are embedded and included with all the other dots, because that touches exactly why we include. A little story about why, illustrating that inclusion is good for all the other kids. One day in 4th grade, the kids were talking about heaven, and they were talking with their teacher about what heaven would be like. And this particular classroom had 2 boys in it who were in wheelchairs. They had spina bifida. And the conversation suddenly grew quiet, and one of the other students said, do you think that you'll be able to walk when you get to heaven, to one of the boys in the wheelchairs? And without hesitation, the boy answered, and he said, no, I don't think so. This is how God created me. But I think I'm going to have a gold-plated wheelchair. And the teacher started crying, and all the kids just were silent. And when they told me that story, I realized everybody learns and everybody grows when you include everybody. Inclusion needs to be well done. All kids deserve to learn. Inclusion is not babysitting. Inclusion is teaching children where they're at. And it requires a big effort to be able to differentiate all across the spectrum. Inclusion requires a collaborative culture where teachers and support people share kids, where they know what kids need and work together to meet those needs. And inclusion requires a commitment to support from the whole community. Elizabeth mentioned tuition equity, but tuition equity is just an example of the commitment that the whole community has to supporting each child, every child. Being a leader in a Christian setting that's committed to inclusion is not a burden. It's a blessing. And if you want that blessing for your community and for your families, one great place to start is to partner with a place like All Belong, where the skills have been developed to help your school be the best it can be. That's about all I've got for now.
Thanks, Mark. I have a couple of questions for you both, but I know that we've been collecting questions throughout this process as well. So what questions do you have at this point?
Well, this is Tessie, and I will share just a couple that we've gotten both prior to and during the webinar itself. And I think you answered a lot of those, but I just want to make sure that they are clarified. So there was a question around, the idea of the images that you showed and the moving from inclusion and belonging. Do you see this also applying to kids with other differences, such as different economic status or coming from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds?
Absolutely. I mean, we do focus support services on students with disabilities and students who are struggling with learning in school, but it impacts all of those other areas too. And it impacts the entire identity of the school. We do have to be careful about not assuming that students who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds have a disability. And I think Mark started to touch on that a little bit. So I'm going to toss this over to him because Mark, you were talking a little bit about not expecting behaviors from those who haven't had the chance to learn them. And so I want to see if you can talk a little bit further about that, if you can get your video and your microphone. There you go.
Thanks. First of all, there is no differentiation of who we're including. When we say we're including, we're talking about inclusion of all children. The model school looks like the kingdom of God. It does include, it is diverse in race. It is diverse in learning styles. It is diverse in learning needs. It is diverse in socioeconomic status. Our goal was to mirror our community. We were an inner city school, and we were a title school. And that did take, some effort in terms of resources, but it starts with a want to. Do you want to include all children? I used to say to a parent, who do you want your children to go to school with? Do you want your children to go to school with just kids that are just like you? Or would you like your children to go to school with all the kids that they could go to school with? And that answer always led to, of course, we want our kids to experience diversity in school. And okay, well, if you're going to experience diversity, it's not free. Some kids are going to have to pay a little less because they can only afford less. And some are going to have to pay more because they can afford more. And that comes with a community commitment to being diverse. So does that answer the question? Is that what you were thinking, Elizabeth?
Yeah, but thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I thought that was great. And you had mentioned something about you're a title school. So are you leveraging, and this is something that came during the session, are you leveraging title resources in the school to support this?
Absolutely. So in order to leverage or to access title resources, of course, you have to have your data. And your data has to show that you are home to some kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch. For us, we had about 25% of our kids that qualified for free and reduced lunch, which didn't make us a title school per se, but it did give us access to a ton of title money. Okay, so we accessed the money, and then we decided all of the title money we received would go towards supporting our inclusion efforts. So you can, for instance, use title money for teacher training. Well, we said, we're only going to use title money for teacher training that focuses on our ability to include all students. Okay, you can access title money to provide support staff for your students. We're only going to provide support staff with our title money that supports our inclusion program. And so because of that, a good chunk of the inclusion program was supported by our federal government at our school. And that does take some know-how, but there are people out there, like people at the school I was at, that know how to do that and know how to interact with their local ISD, their local school district.
There was also a strong community of funders and donors.
Yep. So that, I would say that, yeah, it's a three-legged stool, right? It's access all the money that you can from the federal side. It's make it important to your donors, and then it's share the cost as a community.
Yeah.
You got to put all three legs have to be put into play in order to support a great program.
Great answer. Thanks, Mark.
Excellent. So it sounds like, just listening to all three of you, that there is a need for increased knowledge and skills among the educators. So what type of professional development do you recommend for those who don't have that current background? Is there something that's already accessible?
There are a lot of resources, I know, through you guys and through a lot of different places. When we're talking about inclusive education, we try not to dictate one model of what that needs to look like, but for a school to have a common language certainly helps with collaboration. I'm going to toss it over to Brenda to share a little bit of her experience with some of the trainings, since she mentioned that during her background.
Yes, for example, this past year, we were able to have full day of training more than once that was on SEL, social emotional learning and restorative practices. And again, strengthening the bonds of our learning experience together, expanding our language together, and finding practical ways to engage all students in helping them grow emotionally and socially was extremely beneficial. And we're going to continue that focus into the upcoming year. And of course, that's been very timely for our country as well, for us to have that training. So we're very grateful for it.
Can I add something there, Elizabeth? Whatever the point of training, there are two things. One is get everybody under a common understanding of children. Now, there are a number of frameworks that you can use to understand children, but when you talk with each other, you have to be talking common language about children's strengths and weaknesses, their pink areas and their green areas. And so training that would help you have common language about what strengths and weaknesses children need to have in order to educate them. That's number one. And then the number two thing is how to teach children as individuals, to differentiate instruction, understand by design, UDL. There are a number of tools that you can go towards, but you have to have something that allows your teaching staff to individualize instruction and then to address needs, to support the instruction that needs more instruction. And we got that training through All Belong, to be upfront with you. We asked them and they came in, and so we just followed what they put on the table for us. But we made sure every teacher got trained and that we became a school that this was embedded in the culture. And
that was also all of the efforts that both of your schools put into place. You ensured that they were always research-based, right? And that teachers had enough tools in their tool belt that were research-based, that we were progress monitoring, that we were seeing as part of a multi-tiered system of support. Now, the common language for understanding kids, we use all kinds of minds. There are others, right? Like there are ways to do this. But the importance is having the tools in your belt.
So I wanted to just share for our audience, as you mentioned UDL, and for those who are not familiar, CAST, which is a national center, defines UDL as a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on the scientific insights into how humans learn. So, and I think that's what Elizabeth was mentioning. We have about time for 2 more questions. And one of those questions we got is, how are people running this? Do you have a program that's run by each school, or is it something that's supported? If you have kids with needs, do they work across multiple schools to address those needs?
I loved that you introduced and Kat introduced the Progress Center as being focused on programming and not a program. And I think we have that in common, right? So we are always, I think there's a temptation to think that if we can just build this one thing, then we're done and we're set and we've got it under control. And we all know that kids don't work like that. And neither do us adults, right? So we have to constantly be keeping our end in sight, that culture of belonging in sight, and then flexing and shifting and changing over the years based on individual student needs and on the strengths and the weaknesses that we might have in our own buildings. So we do not implement a program. We come alongside to build what a student might need, and that's where we want to keep it focused on being student-centered. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about that flexing and shifting process?
Give it a little more, flexing and shifting process.
What were some of the things that you had to change about your programming throughout the years? Yeah,
so the biggest thing, of course, the biggest issue that we end up having is teachers see, they want to teach content and they want to teach classrooms. Right? And anything that gets in the way of teaching content and anything that gets in the way of the classroom learning is, in their mind, a problem that needs to be solved. And when there are problems, then they call in our support people to solve the problems. That some kids aren't fitting in the classroom learning, and some kids aren't fitting in the classroom behaviors, or they're impeding the classroom behaviors. And the biggest shift we had was, that's just an inappropriate view of education and children. And we wanted teachers, of course, to see children as individuals. And we didn't want to see behaviors that were outside of the boundary as, impediments. We wanted to see them as opportunities, and we wanted to see inclusion as exciting and joyful, not something that had to be done. So, if you talk about almost everything we did was to promote teachers who agreed with us and demote teachers who did not agree with us. And you start with what you have, and it takes years to promote one culture and demote another. Another thing you talk about these steps in the way, but it's so important that you provide opportunity inside of the teacher's day to communicate with each other about children. If it's important to do, you've got to provide opportunity to do it. Don't tell them you need to talk with each other about kids, but then never give them any time to do it, because then you're not really thinking it's that important. And so I had to change our entire schedule of how we organized our day around providing opportunity to communicate. There's a couple of examples right there.
Those are great examples. Brenda, do you want to share some of yours too?
Oh, I'm thinking of some of the flexing and growing. In one area in particular, there was the involvement in athletics. Okay, so in the early years, maybe an individual who was differently abled might be involved as a manager on the team or something like that. And then we had a group that was called Just for Friends, where we would meet and try various sports together and try to keep fitness a central part of learning and building and just fitness for life, really modeling fitness for life. And then we moved into unified sports, and we, with each passing year, have more of our individuals who are involved in our athletic programs with their peers. So that's just one area. I think of also admissions and how we handle that process in a fair and equitable manner. That has really developed since our early years. So those are just a couple areas. I think of, Mark alluded to it as well, just those early interviews that you have with families and the questions about vision and expectations early on, and setting up a mindset from the very beginning with our families and in partnering with our faculty to make sure that we're expecting the best from each individual, and we're challenging finding that zone of proximal growth and helping each individual grow, and developing that personalized planning, which takes legs with things like classroom matrices and activity matrices, and all based around the goals that have been agreed upon, so that all are seeing the fruit of this. The student is growing, the teachers are feeling encouraged by the fruit of their labor, the parents are pleased that their investments and their collaboration is going well with the school, all starting with strong goals. So those are just some of the areas that I think about that we've been flexing and growing in.
Yeah, we actually included, Brenda, we actually include teachers in our admissions meetings, meeting with the parents. We figure if the kids are going to be in their classroom, they might as well be there at the beginning, learning about the kid right from the beginning. And we start to promote those conversations between parent and teacher before the kids are even enrolled. That's something that we developed more quite recently. And what you were saying makes me think of that.
Yeah,
you know, you can't be kind of doing things behind people's backs where kids suddenly hey, the kid has autism and the autism manifests itself in some pretty violent behaviors during the school year, and we're going to include him in your class. Well, we'd like that child to be included, that teacher to be upfront and, asking questions and talking with the parents and partnering right from the beginning.
Right.
So that's something we had to develop.
Yeah.
Before I pass this back to Elizabeth to share some resources that were requested, I want to thank you, Mark and Brenda, for sharing your experiences. I think these practical applications, strategies that you talked about, meeting with parents prior to, Brenda, you mentioned something earlier that I think is really critical, is educating individuals within your community about how do we communicate and engage appropriately with differently abled folks, right? Because some kids prefer different ways of friendships or interactions, and we can't make assumptions, right, based on a disability category or something else. We need to engage in that conversation with the family and the students. So yeah. I want to pass this to Elizabeth, and then if Elizabeth can share some of the resources that are available to support folks, and then Kat will close up today's session with some resources from the Progress Center that can also help you with supporting students.
Great, thank you so much. The first resource listed here is the endorsement standard that we've created. It has a complete set of indicators and rubrics and metrics and evidence examples to help in self-assessment tools. So I encourage you to check that out. The next one is EANS funding information that is particular to right now. There's a lot of schools are exploring emergency assistance for non-public school funding, and support services is a great way to utilize that funding to improve outcomes for all students. The next one then is back to school resources that we developed, especially, and that was developed last summer. So in the midst of knowing that we had finished with lockdown and we're going back to school in session. So there's a good amount of social emotional resources on that website, and I would encourage you to dig through that. And then great stories of inclusion. We love to tell stories. We think it's important for sharing and celebrating diversity of ability and community. And so those are just some of my favorite stories that we've shared.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. We are going to close up sharing some resources from the Progress Center. So we have some recorded webinars that you can check out that were either hosted from Progress or other OSEP funded centers. So you'll see this first one. This was actually from the National Center for Systemic Improvement. Considerations for fall, applying the essential elements of data literacy to respond to student and system needs. Inclusive listening, building understanding and supporting collaboration. We also have an IEP series that really looks at each individual component of the IEP. So one of our first ones, the IEP, what every educator needs to know to promote progress. And then another webinar, parentally placed private school students with disabilities. We also have an awesome video tool that looks at high leverage practices. And then very similar to what Elizabeth was just saying about storytelling, we have stories from the classroom, and these are straight from special educators, really looking at how am I doing this in my classroom? They're short little snippets that are awesome as a way to look at how does this look in real life? We also have more to come. If you check out our site, promotingprogress.org, and scroll to the bottom, you can sign up to stay connected. We have a mailing list. We'd also love for you to check us out on Facebook or Twitter at K12 Progress. Thank you for your time and joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth, Brenda, and Mark. We are fortunate to really learn from those that are in the field and doing the work to meet all students' needs at a variety of placements.